to read those stories. She grew up a right-wing evangelical in the thick of the culture wars and is now an incisive critic of the Christian right. Stroop earned a PhD in modern Russian history from Stanford University in 2012, a columnist for Open Democracy, and a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches. Stroop's work, most of which focuses on religion, politics, and sometimes foreign policy, has also appeared in the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, Playboy, Dame Magazine, the Moscow Times, Alternate, and other outlets. As a speaker, Chrissy takes pride in her ability to address secular audiences, faith-based audiences, and the general public on issues related to democracy, pluralism, and human rights. Stroop currently resides in Portland, Oregon. So welcome, Chrissy Stroop. And you know what? I know an awful lot of people who are moving to the Pacific Northwest. So at least they'll be in good company when they get up there.
That's all right. It's all right up here. We're starting to have worse fire seasons than used to be. You know, when I moved here in 2019, I thought, oh, we probably have 20 years before we have a California fire season problem. No, but yeah, overall, I really like it up here. So anyway, thank you, Jeannie, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to you and Lindsay for your organizational efforts. And it's really my pleasure to be joining you all this evening to talk about perhaps a not very pleasant subject, but one that I think we need to talk about, which is Christian nationalism. And part of what I've been doing in my own work for several years now, probably 6 or 8 years, is thinking about Christian nationalism. Even before that term became common, I was thinking of it in terms of authoritarianism, Christian authoritarianism. I have a PhD in modern Russian history. I've studied the Soviet Union. And, you know, weirdly enough, I was able to see a lot of parallels between that and the kind of Christian community that I was raised in. And in fact, of course, I'm sure as many of you are familiar, and I did some of the early research into this for Political Research Associates, since the Soviet Union collapsed, right-wing Christians got really, you know, interested in post-Soviet Russia and came to be really sympathetic to it. And many of them really cozied up to Putin, although the war in Ukraine has changed that. And it's because, you know, it was never the authoritarianism that bothered them. It was the atheism. So once you make it Christian authoritarianism, it makes perfect sense to them. It's what they want. And Putin becomes an admirable figure. And anyone who was actually listening closely to, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's speeches in the 1980s about the decadent West and how it's in such horrible moral decline would have understood that, you know, there are a lot of Russians who were very conservative Christian nationalists, and Americans admired them. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself, as you may or may not know, eventually received, well, he got Russian citizenship after his Soviet citizenship was revoked way back when. He moved back to Russia. He died, you know, a big time Putin fan. So yeah, weird sorts of parallels between my academic research and the kind of authoritarian environment that I grew up in. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Christian nationalism as an authoritarian movement, how that is cultivated, what kinds of mechanisms they use for socialization and indoctrination of people in their own communities, as well as efforts that they make towards people in other communities in their efforts to essentially take as much control as possible in the United States and try to abolish the separation of church and state, which they don't believe in. I mean, you know, they'll tell you that it's an entirely invented thing, although that's completely absurd. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I grew up with. So I've got a slide presentation put together. I'll probably go ahead and start screen sharing now and just get over to my, where did that PowerPoint go? There it is. Okay. So go back to the beginning. And yeah, so what I'm going to do with this presentation, after which we'll open it up for Q&A and just interaction and feedback. And by the way, I really do, when I do these virtual events, like, don't get me wrong, I love doing them, but I miss the direct audience interaction that you can have when you do a live event, because usually I would have some back and forth during the talk. I'd pose questions to the audience. I'm that kind of speaker. I prefer that kind of informal approach. But given that it is a virtual presentation, we'll kind of just stick to the slides and before we open it up for Q&A. But anyway, what I'm going to do with the presentation is kind of look at the big picture, look at some current events, including in the state of Arizona, that have to do with how we see Christian nationalism playing out in real time in America, often at the state level, but certainly with many of our national level politicians as well, and with the Supreme Court. And then I'll take this general framework that I've established and start talking specifically about certain institutions and how they are used to cultivate Christian nationalists, and why I think it's important for secular advocates to understand, not just that it's a serious church-state separation issue, as I'm sure everyone here would almost certainly agree, that Christian schools, including far, extremist Christian schools that teach young earth creationism and everything else, exactly the kinds of schools that I went to, by the way, and that I graduated high school from, receive a lot of taxpayer funding through vouchers. But I think people need to understand, the general public needs to understand more about how Christian schools operate, how homeschooling operates, what sort of Christian right lobbying organizations that fly under the radar for a lot of people are involved in the deregulation of education, and just put forth some sort of long-term strategy ideas for things that I think we should focus on, although the immediate prospects might not be too good, in terms of trying to create a better situation where it's less easy for people to indoctrinate children into extremism in general and Christian nationalism in particular. So let's take a look at the very big picture. Where did Christian nationalism in the United States come from? So you could go back very far, and look for the roots of this. Certainly, already in the first few decades of the 19th century, there were a number of people pushing back against the founding fathers and their sort of disdain for religion. Of course, many of them thought that it was important for the general populace to have some religious beliefs so they would be better citizens. Of course, I completely disagree with that approach, but the founding fathers tended to think that people like themselves certainly didn't need religion to be moral or ethical, and they didn't like a lot of the specific dogma or the fanaticism, and they absolutely did intend, the vast majority of them anyway, to enshrine separation of church and state in the Constitution, and they did that. But you already see, in the early 19th century, all kinds of false portraits of George Washington as this very pious Christian and so forth. So Christian nationalism has deep roots, but if you want to look for the more immediate roots and the historical events that kind of led up to Christian nationalism that we see today, that we associate with coming into power, particularly an important moment would be the 1980 presidential election, in which they backed Ronald Reagan, becoming an important force in our politics, building institutions that they use to pursue their goals, lobbies, and that sort of thing. So for many of them, the immediate context is reaction against the 1960s, the turbulence of that decade, and the way that conservative Christians understood that turbulence. So of course, I'm talking about the civil rights movement. If you look at early movers and shakers in what became the moral majority, the Christian coalition, and all these iterations of Christian right organizing that have come since then, people like Jerry Falwell Sr., in his sermons, and these sermons are actually very difficult to find now because Thomas Road Baptist Church and Liberty University, they don't want everyone to just go around and find these quotations or this audio of Jerry Falwell calling Martin Luther King a communist, but he did. These are the kind of sermons that he preached in the 1960s when what became the modern Christian right was still openly advocating for racial segregation. Today, they don't usually say that part out loud, Although Mike Braun from my home state of Indiana did fairly recently, during discussions of whether Roe v. Wade should or would be overturned, talk about, he was asked directly if he thought Roe v. Wade should be overturned, which of course he does. He's a Republican senator from Indiana, whether he also thinks that Loving v. Virginia should be overturned. That is, of course, the Supreme Court case that legalized interracial marriage across the United States. And he said yes. He clearly understood what the question was, and he said he doesn't think that you can pick and choose there. If you think you need to send these rights back to the states, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So the mask dropped in that case, but he walked it back. He said, "Oh, I'm not racist. You know, I didn't understand the question." But if you watch the video, he clearly understood the question. But anyway, it's 1970s to 1980s that actually saying that you're for racial segregation, particularly in connection with the Bob Jones case that was happening then, becomes something they don't talk about out loud anymore. And by the end of the 70s, they're fixated on abortion. But you'll also notice that during the 1970s, they are building a lot of institutions. So including the publishing houses that create the curricula for Christian schools and homeschooling. And when I say Christian schools here, I generally mean evangelical and fundamentalist schools. Some of them are church schools, some of them are interdenominational. And a Becca book is one of the most popular still today, publishers that they use for their very, very slanted textbooks. And I'll show you some examples of that later. They create the Heritage Foundation, you know, this major think tank and lobby to promote a right-wing Christian agenda. Focus on the Family comes along in the 1970s. I assume that most people in the audience are probably generally familiar with Focus on the Family and Dr. James Dobson. But if anyone hasn't heard that name, James Dobson, he was the Christian right's answer to Dr. Benjamin Spock. He wrote books with titles like Dare to Discipline, which probably tells you a lot about him already. And then, of course, Jerry Falwell forms the Moral Majority in 1979. It's not long after that Ralph Reed forms the Christian Coalition. And by the 1980s, this is paying off in political power, right? So this really crystallizes with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. People think it's sort of ironic that they rejected Jimmy Carter, who actually was a Southern Baptist. And there's a whole other story there of how the Southern Baptist Convention was at that very moment in the process of purging people with views like Jimmy Carter's from any positions of power and influence in the denomination. And basically there was a conservative takeover that happened in the 70s and 80s and was complete by the mid 90s. And then from that time on, as I've got on this slide, HSLDA, that stands for the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. It's a lobbying organization that really flies under the radar for, I think, most of the American public, and that's unfortunate. So generally the way I talk about them when I bring them up is to say, the HSLDA is the single most important Christian right lobbying organization you've never heard of. And you really should pay attention to it. So they start pursuing all kinds of court cases, advocating for the deregulation of homeschooling. And they're very successful. So today, of course, we do have a patchwork of homeschooling regulation, at least on paper across the United States. But in general, while it is state by state, it's mostly pretty minimal. And even in the states that do have some regulations on paper, there's just not much enforcement. So of course, homeschooling can be done responsibly, but most homeschooling in the United States today is still done for religious ideological purposes, for the purposes of indoctrinating children into Christian extremism. And some parents out there may have experience with this. And again, there can be legitimate reasons for homeschooling, but in many parts of the country, it is very hard to find a homeschooling co-op that is not explicitly fundamentalist Christian in character. And a lot of people get sucked into fundamentalist Christianity and get radicalized that way. So this is kind of the big picture. This is the backstory. You know, this would be Star Wars: A New Hope, if you want to think about it, you know, in those terms. This is where the ball got rolling that eventually brought us right-wing Christians rallying behind Donald Trump and supporting him as someone who gave them literally an unprecedented amount of power for presidential administration, and someone who actually pursued their agenda more vigorously than any other previous president, even George W. Bush. I mean, George W. Bush wasn't about to move the United States embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem because of a lot of people who think that has something to do with the apocalypse. But Donald Trump did it. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't believe in the end times. So, you know, it's funny. Everybody says, oh, the Christian right, oh, they're so duped. Oh, Donald Trump just used them. That has it exactly backwards. Leaders of the Christian right, people who are still around out there, like Ralph Reed, and also people of a younger generation, people like Tony Perkins at the Family Research Council. Let me tell you this, they're a lot smarter than Donald Trump, and I think they were using him a lot more than he was using them. But anyway, so that's the big picture. And with this institution building, and particularly this focus on education, which, as I note on the slide here, kind of started with creating Christian schools as segregation academies. And then, you know, they stopped talking about that, but they were still mostly very white. Now, some of them today are more racially integrated than they used to be. And that has something to do with the voucher funding as well, making things more widely available. But they still do tend to be, you know, incubators of extremist views. And those extremist views, I know this is a 501c3 and it's not supposed to be partisan, but those extremist views do tend to overlap with the Republican Party these days. So let's move on. Let's look at some sort of contemporary examples of Christian nationalism happening in our politics now at the state level. I've got a screenshot here and a quote from this Denver Post article about Doug Mastriano's win in the GOP gubernatorial primary in the state of Pennsylvania, and how basically a sort of praise and worship event and concert broke out after his victory was declared. And he started quoting scripture himself. So a man who actually was at January 6th, by the way, where there was also all kinds of Christian nationalist symbolism, rhetoric, prayers, the Christian flag, and so forth. He participated in that, and now he is the Republican candidate for governor in the state of Pennsylvania, and he is very overtly a God and country sort of guy. And you'll see how very partisan they make this. So Mastriano says that freedom will be lost if the Democrats win, and says God uses the foolish to confound the wise. That's from the Bible. It's something that people with a sort of Christians with a sort of inferiority complex maybe like to quote, or when they're in the midst of science denial or something like that. I mean, I remember hearing this verse growing up for, you know, in the context of why we don't, quote, believe in evolution. Because, you know, obviously we're supposed to believe the Bible as the word of God, and, you know, it sounds foolish to the world, but that's because all these scientists just want to sin, and that's why they think that the earth is billions of years old, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, just want to point out, this is definitely, we're having kind of a Christian nationalist moment in politics right now, although it's a strong presence and has been for a long time. And then also in connection with current events, I thought I'd go ahead and just bring up, you know, Arizona State Senator Rick Gray and these comments that he made about guns and school shootings in the aftermath of the horrific shooting that happened last week in Uvalde, Texas. He blamed this on lack of God in schools. And these are talking points that I grew up with. You know, by the time I come onto the scene as a small child in the 1980s, the Christian right is no longer openly calling for racial segregation, but the main things they're getting upset about are abortion, gay rights, and prayer being taken out of school, right? So they want to overturn Shemp and so forth. Anyway, I'm now going to ask Lindsay if she can play this clip, because we tried to play it from my computer and the audio wasn't working for some reason. So just listen to these comments. This is Christian nationalism in the wild in Arizona.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time getting this to play. Of course, now it's not working that we're live. Let me try one more time.
It's okay if it doesn't work. I mean, I think we can live without it. And I put the gist of his comments on the slide there. I didn't do the whole quote because it was too big, but yeah.
Let me try one more time. Hang on. Oh gosh, of course, right? I'm so sorry, it's refusing to play.
No worries. I mean, this is
sorry.
It's okay. This is something that we shared out too with our members. And, just like Chrissy said, this was a tirade that took a tragedy and, basically focused in on the fact that those non-theists who exist are somehow at fault for this. After that, there was a recommendation by another senator that we arm all of our teachers, and at the same time in our House, what was being debated was whether we could trust teachers to teach accurate history. So it's this crazy kind of hypocrisy. And I wanted to also, since I went on camera and I see that somebody has their hand raised. So please, if your hand is raised, you can go ahead and put it down, but put your question in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we hand those questions off to our guest speaker today. So go ahead, take it away, Chrissy.
Thanks, Jeannie. Yeah, I'm sorry. Normally, I would really like to take questions and audience interaction during a talk. That's my style. That's how I roll. But it doesn't really work with virtual talks. So we'll take your questions at the end. But I certainly appreciate questions and comments that people want to share. And I will go back to my slide presentation now. So let's see if I can get that back up. So here we are. And these kind of talking points, I published an article for Religion Dispatches last week with the headline, "Who's really politicizing school shootings?" Because the Christian right has been shamelessly politicizing school shootings for decades. One thing that they do with this is try to advocate to get more people into homeschooling or Christian schools. But the bigger talking point here, and it's actually very similar to some talking points that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, again, the Russian writer who, exposed the Soviet Gulag system through his novels, that he was making back in the 1980s, that godlessness leads to barbarism. And so if you believe that or claim to believe that, then you're going to advocate for a whole host of positions that would emphasize God and religious or spiritual beliefs in public life. Now, that was a big part of the Cold War, and there were kind of two sides to this issue of sacralization of American society that we saw in the Cold War. There was the sort of more official and more somewhat inclusive side, where they started talking about Judeo-Christian values, even though they were really just Christian values, and they were just trying to sort of be inclusive by adding Jewish in there. Where there was a book of sociology written in the 1950s called Protestant Catholic Jew, basically kind of trying to make the case that Americans are a religious people, and these are the three American religions. But there was also this ugly underbelly of a more Christian nationalist side. But in this moment, though, of the early Cold War, it all kind of came together. And as you know, I mean, this is when we get "In God We Trust" made the national motto, put on the coins. It's in the early to mid 1950s that they're doing that sort of thing that is popular. Now, by the 1960s, this general social consensus that to fight the godless commies, we have to be a religious society is fading away. But it's the people who represented the more anti-pluralist side of that discourse from the early Cold War. They doubled down on it and eventually build those institutions that I talked about in that earlier slide. and kind of come back as the Christian right as we've known it since then. And so, and this idea that if you don't have God in schools or in public life and people don't believe in God, they'll get the message that we're just animals, goes back to the late 19th century in Christian apologetics. And it was used during World War I to accuse, by the Allies, to accuse the Germans of being barbarians and atheists and so forth. So there's actually this very old discourse of essentially accusing people who do horrible things of being atheists and or doing those horrible things because they are atheists. And when it comes to school shootings, you know, I remember growing up with these kinds of talking points. And I mean, I was already, by the time Columbine happened, I turned 19 that year. So I was starting to kind of pull away and check out. But this discourse really ramped up around that time. It was used for other, I mean, it was used before school shootings were a big issue as well, though. That just, you know, what are you teaching kids? Look at all the crime today, you know, look at all the gay people, whatever. It's because we took God out of the schools. This is the big thing that they go back to when they tell you that everything went wrong in the 1960s, which is something that conservative Christians of a certain age say a lot. Believe me, I have uncles. But anyway, so that's the context for these comments that Rick Gray was making, and for how Christian nationalists are responding to things like school shootings, trying to pursue sort of two prongs of their agenda at once. Well, let's try to get God back in the public schools, and that's going to make better kids, better citizens, and, oh, public schools are dangerous, so let's just take the kids out of them and put them in homeschooling or Christian schools. It's a very self-serving kind of approach. And I'll show you another example that's much older than this, just to show you that this has been going on. So a little warning here, the next slide does show a depiction of a school shooter. It's just a little sketch. It's not a very well-drawn depiction, but it's from a Christian tract, from Liberty Gospel Tracts. Oops. So this is an actual tract. I only discovered this one a few years ago, and somebody put it on the windshield of my car at a Twisty Treat in Tampa, Florida. Sorry, I'm just going to go ahead and laugh at that. Yeah, I lived in Tampa, Florida from 2015 to 2018. So I have a copy of this one. It occupies a kind of special place in my tract collection. But anyway, beware of killer kids. This shows you right here how they started linking, after Columbine, school shooters to the teaching of evolution and making this frankly silly argument, but unfortunately one that we have to take seriously as something that they put out there into the discourse and that they believe, because it has a negative social impact, that if you teach children that we're just animals, then children will behave like animals. Apparently, animals slaughter each other in cold blood a lot. I didn't realize that, but yeah, no, it doesn't really make sense on any level except this kind of visceral, emotional level. And I mean, it also works for people who are already primed for science denial and disinformation. One of those three D words that I want to talk about that's so important to cultivating an authoritarian community. Disinformation, we've been talking about it a lot these days. Division, of course, disinformation is one key mechanism through which you can pursue division, and then demonization of the people that you've divided yourself from, which is an important precursor to the kind of political violence that we saw on January 6th, for example, and a precursor to genocide is the dehumanization or demonization of the people that you don't like. But in this case, you can see an example of how they're arguing that teaching kids that they're animals makes them behave like animals, and that's bad. I think one thing that we want to talk about, oh, Jeannie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, you know, this makes me think too of, like I said, one of the other things that Senator Rick Gray said during his tirade, whatever his justification for this kind of mass violence, these mass shootings, was that because the kids don't have any scriptural type of teaching, well, they just think of themselves as animals. And one of the people in our legal department brought up the fact that, this is the same kind of language that was used during the colonization of the Americas. And at the very same time in the House, we had a Representative Jennifer Germain, who was talking about, because there was a bill, SB 1411, that would deny teachers the ability to provide an accurate account of our history. And she is of Native descent. Her daughter is as well. And she was saying how disappointed she was over the fact that her daughter, under this bill, would not be allowed to hear how people perceived her. And so I don't know if it's as much of a question as it is a comment about this idea that we are trying to neutralize the voices of typically marginalized communities by denying them the ability to learn about their own history, and denying others who otherwise may not have to learn about their own history. There's just so many parallels here. And so again, more of a comment than a question, but something that made me think of it.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, Jeannie. We absolutely see Christian nationalism, which sort of broadly defined would be this insistence that United States governmental structures should be brought into conformity with what Christian nationalists would see as God's will. And so there's a whole slate of related issues in their minds right now that they're fixating on and having moral panics about. And those issues clearly have everything to do with wanting to drag us back by hook or by crook to the 1950s in all the worst ways. But they include things like the panic around supposed critical race theory. I mean, it's not even really real critical race theory is not taught in elementary schools. It's a postgraduate sort of level theory that people are introduced to when they study law, but that we can't talk about systemic racism. They call it CRT, and now they pronounce that with a sneer. It's their new buzzword. But also, the Don't Say Gay law that was passed in Florida. I understand there was a similar law in Arizona passed in 1991 that was just repealed a few years ago, which is interesting because, this year, Governor Ducey signed into law a couple of pretty vicious anti-trans bills. All of these issues are closely related. And I think it's important for secular advocates to look at all of that whole slate of issues as, an important space where we need to contend for separation of church and state, sort of where the rubber meets the road. These people are showing up for school board meetings and screaming at the school board, telling them not to teach the truth about race and American history, telling them not to teach anything about non-heteronormative gender identities or sexualities and so forth. So yeah, it's all very much of a piece. When you think about Christian nationalism and this idea of what does that mean? It means you want to have the United States be quote unquote obedient to God. And you ask, well, what does that mean in practice? It's all of these sorts of things, which just happen to uphold white supremacist patriarchy, because that's the kind of God they believe in. And I want to talk, just pause now and talk briefly about how these attitudes are not just things that people say, but they can also contribute directly into street violence, and how with the Christian nationalist movement that we're seeing today, you have this kind of merger of also right-wing Christians, Christian performers with street thugs and street brawlers, also around issues like masks and vaccines. That was what was going on in Portland last August when we had a couple of events. One of them involved this Polish-Canadian pastor, Artur Pawlowski. Another involved Sean Foyt, who is associated with the Bethel Redding Church from California. He did a whole series of worship concerts with spiritual warfare, speaking in tongues and the whole 9 yards around the United States, over that year, and he didn't usually get the proper permits, and people refused to wear masks. It was all about not wearing masks for Jesus. And when he came to Portland, you see that picture there, you probably can't see it very well, but that was his sort of ragtag security team. And that would be Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, other street brawling thugs who did indeed engage in violence after the event. And that's what they were there for. So we're seeing this real merger of kind of Christian evangelical public figures that people might associate with things like worship music with Christian nationalism and just, patriot militias and that sort of thing on the streets. And it's, frankly, it's troubling. But anyway, so with that background and those current events in mind, just here's a sort of brief definition of these terms and the relationships between them. So disinformation, particularly with the rise of social media and the way that was manipulated for the 2016 election and the Russian troll farms we've all learned about and so forth. Disinformation is something that we've started to talk about a lot in our society, but it isn't new. As someone who attended Christian schools in the 1980s and the 1990s, and had those very slanted Christian textbooks and was also reading all kinds of these little pamphlets, instead of like a proper sort of like discussion of science, we've got these little magazines called God's World, and they told us how evolution was a lie and God created everything. So disinformation, I think it's helpful to look at in terms of the information economy of a particular community. So obviously, authoritarian political movements will try to flood the whole public sphere with disinformation and try to keep it from being censored or flagged as disinformation. But they also need some kind of information control for people in their own communities. And long before the rise of Fox News, we still had Christian bookstores. We had televangelists providing disinformation for the Christian right, helping to socialize people into Christian extremism. One of the purposes of that is to divide people, to create division, create this idea that you are different and better than people who are not like you. Part of this, of course, is also teaching kids in these communities and adults that they need to try to convert other people, but people who won't or can't be converted or who aren't as Christian or as you, are valid targets for political campaigns to curtail their rights. So you look at any authoritarian political movement in history, and you'll see that, certain kinds of people are defined as the people or the nation. Other groups of people fall outside of that, are othered, and become subjected to violence. Part of this also is what we can call majoritarian grievance culture. Obviously, still today, most Americans are Christians, but right-wing American Christians and fundamentalists have long cultivated this idea that Christians are persecuted, right? That they're this persecuted minority and they're just fighting back. And you may have noticed that Donald Trump uses that same kind of rhetoric, right? He's been treated very unfairly, so he just has to fight back, right? They represent themselves as acting defensively, even while they are being violent toward the people that they demonize. And then they do engage in demonizing rhetoric as a means of justifying violence. One thing I just want to mention briefly when we talk about Christian nationalists is how much they use this concept of spiritual warfare. I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of Trump surrounded by conservative Christians, black and white, laying their hands on him, praying for him, or think of the videos of Paula White, his spiritual advisor, speaking in tongues, praying for the 2020 election results to be overturned, praying against demons. And I grew up with this too. I mean, it was long before Paula White. Christian nationalists tend to see their vision for America as something that has to be achieved through what they see as spiritual warfare, which they also then map onto current events and history. It's very black and white, good versus evil. And they like to jokingly call Democrats democrats or demon rats. Those kind of jokes actually can have very negative consequences. So I wouldn't really call it a joke. But if you read some of evangelical literature, or you watch evangelical movies, they're terrible, unless you want to laugh. I mean, you could do a Mystery Science Theater 3000 sort of thing, and that's actually pretty funny. Especially, I would recommend, if you're gonna go that route, watch the Kirk Cameron version of Left Behind. It is hilarious. But anyway, they create this notion that the people that disagree with them are not just people who disagree with them. They are literally influenced by demons, maybe possessed by demons. That's bad news if you want to avoid violence. And then finally, just a quote here from my recent article on politicization of school shootings by the right, and specifically the Christian right, talking about how this rhetoric of taking God out of the public schools is used as a justification for laws requiring the display of the national motto "In God We Trust," for example. When Florida passed that law, they used that kind of rhetoric, and it was shortly after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting. Oddly enough, because it was Florida, that bill there was introduced by a Democrat who is also an African-American woman and also a self-styled prophetess who's been accused of all kinds of financial improprieties. But as I said, it's Florida. It's usually Republicans introducing these kind of bills, but at least at the state level, Democrats can be Christian nationalists as well. But just pointing out again, in my childhood, in Christian schools, we were very fixated on this whole thing about God needs to be in school or people will behave like beasts. And, in Christian schools, kids they have this idea just pounded into their head over and over that we need to make sure that America is obedient to God so America can be blessed by God. And that means, banning abortion, banning LGBTQ rights, putting prayer back into the public schools or getting rid of public schools altogether. And then one thing that you hear a lot is that it's impossible to create a neutral school. It's impossible to educate kids in a truly pluralist environment. For them, there's no neutrality. So if you're not teaching Christianity, what you're teaching kids, they argue, is secular humanism. It's a complete nonsense argument, but it's something that extremists like. I mean, it puts everything in very black and white terms. And so they'll argue, kids not learning Christianity in school, that means they're essentially just learning to be good little humanists. It's very unrealistic relative to what happens in a lot of American schools across much of this country. But realism doesn't have a lot to do with, the Christian right's views on things. But that argument is persuasive to a lot of people in those communities. There can be no neutrality. That is why you need religious education. Okay, we've already seen that slide. Sorry about that. Anyway, now just a couple quick things on Christian schools, just a couple of fast facts. There was this really great report. I've got it linked here. Lindsay has my slides, and she's welcome to share them around with folks. Just don't, pass them on publicly or anything like that. But if you want to click on these links and follow up on these links later, you'll see that this reporting on what kids are being taught in Christian schools. And there are about 2,400 non-Catholic Christian schools in the United States that receive public funding via voucher and tax credit programs. I don't think we have any information on how many there might be that don't receive voucher funding. And these are schools that are teaching alternative facts. They're definitely not teaching anything that's correct about race in American history. They're definitely not teaching kids that it's okay to have a non-heteronormative gender identity or sexuality. Quite the opposite. And here's just a quote from that article. Someone who grew up in going to these Christian schools remembers being told that dancing was sin, gay people were all child molesters, mental illness was a function of satanic influence. These are all things I've heard in evangelical environments as well. Not necessarily that my school would officially have endorsed all of these statements, but certainly some people in the school believe things like this. They talk about slavery as Black immigration. Environmentalists are denounced. I don't remember ever hearing anyone call environmentalists hippie witches, but I do remember a family friend that I grew up with, my family, one of our family friends said that, like, he liked to say that environmentalists worship the creation rather than the creator. And so obviously they're idolaters, and he called them Hindus, which was very racist. But yeah, they don't like environmentalism. They don't like thinking about climate change, and they generally deny that it's a problem. And then here's a quote from an essay that I wrote that just talks about, again, this idea of Christian nationalism, how it is just thrown in your face. We also said 3 pledges every day, first to the American flag, then to the Christian flag, then to the Bible, in that order. So very much fusing this idea of God and country. And we had this verse written on, one of the walls in the elementary school building in my K-12 Christian school. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And we understood what that meant because we were constantly being told that it was our job to stop all these evil liberals from killing babies and so forth, right? So extreme indoctrination and politicization from a very young age happening in these kinds of schools. And we have over 2,000 of them, almost, about 2,400, taking taxpayer funding to teach these kinds of things in the United States. And I know I come back to this point in a lot of presentations that I give. It's kind of one of my soapboxes, but I really think this is something that secular advocates should care about and start really playing the long game on, because at least one area where we can try to do something about this is to attempt to undercut that taxpayer funding. Maybe eventually, probably with a different Supreme Court, we could start to end that practice, which would really help. But anyway, I'll stop there for now, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and open it up for Q&A.
I really appreciate that conversation, and especially what you said about homeschooling. I wasn't really aware of the homeschooling lobby and just how powerful it is, though I'm not surprised. But what you said about vouchers and how that may be our opportunity, but given the rulings that have taken place and what we're likely going to see happen even more of, like, what kind of tactic? Because this is something that, so Diane Post is the head of our legal team here, and she is ferocious when it comes to monitoring, what happens with regards to the blurring of church and state at the school level. And given, recent rulings and the fact that we have here in Arizona a legislature that is very sympathetic towards the idea of opening up taxpayer funding, like, what can our members do? Because we also have some really active members who care very much. They'll write, they'll call, they'll email, they'll show up at the Capitol. What can we do at this point in a state like Arizona?
Yeah, that's a great question. And state level battles do still remain one of the very most important places to show up. We're not going to do well at the Supreme Court right now. And unfortunately, I fully expect the Supreme Court to rule this summer that if you have voucher fundings for charter schools or private education, that you cannot exclude religious schools, that it will essentially require states to fund religious education. So again, this is a very sort of long-term battle. But if you want to help kids who are being indoctrinated through extremist Christian homeschooling, or in these kinds of Christian schools that teach anti-gay views, racist views, young earth creationism, and the whole 9 yards, I think there are a lot of fronts where the first step is going to be to sort of just change the national conversation, work toward changing public opinion, just raise awareness, because a lot of people really don't know what is taught to young, impressionable evangelical kids. I do think homeschooling is an area where if we had an effective counter lobby to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, if enough of the public really cared, we could probably start to win some victories on children's rights, and we could start to push back and create some space maybe for children to have some say in their own education. Of course, in the United States, we do not have there is actually no federal right to a comprehensive secondary education. A lot of people don't know this, but this was very clearly established in the 1973 Supreme Court decision in Wisconsin v. Yoder, which if you've heard of it, you probably think, oh, that's an Amish case. Well, yes, it is. But it has many implications beyond Amish communities. And also, as some of you may know, there's a really interesting movement starting to happen right now with ex-Amish, or people who consider themselves non-compliant Amish, who are trying to fight back for more, they want to change their own communities for the better, but they feel like they're being hampered by things like Wisconsin v. Yoder, which ruled that if you have a religious reason for not wanting to educate your children past the elementary level, you don't have to. So Amish communities, I think it's up through 6th grade, or is it 8th grade? I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but in any case, they don't get a secondary education. And their parents are perfectly legally allowed to deprive them of that education. A friend of mine is ex-Amish, and she actually ran away, lived with an uncle, so she could go to high school, and then eventually went to college, and now she's an amazing children's rights advocate. A lot of times the people doing this work, they're not known, they're not heard. So one thing I think everybody can do is try to amplify their voices, because when you think about changing policy over the long term in the big picture, people's compelling stories can be really powerful. But a lot of times they're just not heard because the way that our public sphere is structured, it's really hard to get counter narratives and counter messages through. But yeah, children's rights, the United States is the only UN member state that hasn't signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's a federal issue that everyone can advocate for. Not that we're going to win anytime soon, but the more people who are making noise about it, I think the better.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And we need more noise to be made from the bottom of the ballot all the way up. I think a lot of people feel like they're doing something when they get those, nationwide action alerts and, but it's right here in our own backyards oftentimes. And it's important to know who to vote for in those judicial races as well. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to start off. There's a lot of commentary. There's a lot of people who are talking about their own indoctrination in religious schools at various levels, Catholics, other denominations of churches. So I hope you all have found your people a little bit and are able to either celebrate or commiserate or whatever. But the question that I'm seeing right now, this comes from a member who couldn't attend tonight. Her question, though, is to ask Chrissy Stroop if you have heard of or worked with the Clergy Project. So that's part one of the question. Are you familiar with that organization?
Heard of, yes. I've not worked with them, but I think what they do is admirable.
Okay. And they go on to say that they tried to join them, but the requirement is that you have to be a former clergy to be a member. And so this member says, I'd love to hear how that organization works, how many members they have. Some of their stories would be enough to make anyone leave the church, exclamation point. I was never a believer and had serious doubts from my earliest exposure. So I guess you are familiar of them, but you haven't worked with them. So I guess it would be something that we could try to at least promote with our members, because it sounds like there are quite a few of us who have our own stories of growing up in a evangelical background.
I think it's very important to create fora for sharing those kind of stories. And, and if someone just cut me a blank check to start a 501c3 to do something, I think I would want to set up something like a scholarship fund, or even just a kind of fellowship fund for people, not just clergy, who really need help. escaping from their Christian nationalist or, other extremist religious backgrounds. And, in this evangelical community, it's this kind of loose community and movement that exists mostly online, but there are some in-person meetings, discussions and things. There's a lot of TikTokers now, and I've totally lost track of it because I don't really do TikTok. I'm 41 years old. I mean, but and I'm on Twitter, which is kind of where most of it started. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of overlap with like ex-Mormons, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. I've worked with fascinating ex-Amish people, and through them also with some like former ultra-Orthodox Jews and former like extremist Muslims. And there's differences, but also important similarities and things to discuss. And I mean, the reason that Lauren O'Neill and I came up with the book Empty the Pews, which we put together as this essay anthology. There's a lot of people in it besides just us, but we also put together, the introduction, and we each contributed essays. My reason for it is that I really wanted it to be an intervention in our public sphere, just trying to create a space for these stories to be heard. Because I think that for a lot of quote unquote coastal elites, they don't know and they don't care, and maybe they sort of don't even want to know. Or they just find it, but maybe a more charitable interpretation is they just find it impossible to believe what Christian right communities are actually like, how authoritarian, cartoonishly authoritarian they are, but they are.
Yeah, and I mean, you speak of it quite frequently in your writings, that it is cult-like behavior. And as I've said, many of our members feel like that they've escaped a cult in many ways. And I remember watching the, it was I think Jehovah's Witnesses documentary that came out within the last 6-9 months or something like that. And I was shocked by it, some of the things that came out. And I think too, to answer before, when somebody was asking, how do we combat this narrative of those of us who are non-theistic, agnostic, atheist, whatever, whatever we call ourselves, I think it's really important for us to kind of call that out when we see it, and talk about what just happened recently with the Southern Baptist Council and what we saw happen, what we've seen happen, many of us throughout our lifetimes, with regards to the Catholic Church. If we're going to talk about protecting children, we can go ahead and unabashedly claim to be non-theistic and to stand behind that without any kind of shame or social stigma at this point.
And I'll just add Amish in there as
Yeah.
well. There's recently been a lot of revelations about sexual abuse and rape and incest and marital rape in Amish communities. And the common thread through all of these kinds of communities, the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist Convention, and it's not just the Southern Baptist Convention. In other evangelical spaces, I know there's a lot of abuse going on too, but we just don't necessarily have a sort of clear picture of the extent of it. But everybody has stories who grew up in these communities. If it didn't happen to you, people that happened to. I certainly do. And I mean, the worst, my sister and I were spanked sometimes with a wooden spoon. We did not go through direct sexual violence as kids, but there were people around us who certainly did. One of my Christian school teachers in high school turned out to be a predator who was arrested and convicted of sexual misconduct with minor female students, people in the church. And what the common thread through all of this is that this is of course patriarchy and patriarchal authority protected by religion, which is actually a very powerful cultural force. So when you invoke God and something like the church, and you have to protect the reputation of the church or Jesus or our community, and you put religious authority behind that, then it has a lot of power for people to keep their silence,
Yeah. I mean, it's a part of your whole entire identity. And especially, I mean, even for me who grew up in a family that was really non-theistic in nature, many of my family members have started attending the church of, our 45th president. And so it makes conversations really difficult, to the point
Mm.
where there are certain family members that I haven't talked to in almost a decade. And while it's heartbreaking, I can't and won't compromise my values, and I miss them very much. And I wish there was some middle ground that we could find, but it seems that in many areas of our life these days, that's just become harder and harder to find. So I'm gonna real quick just kind of go through, and I want everybody to know that there are some good links that are coming in. Recoveryfromreligion.org could be helpful for some of you who want to have those conversations. Somebody mentioned Alex, who's with a Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix and a wonderful volunteer constantly throughout the Valley. He says the clergy project isn't something that the general public can join. It's set up for present and former clergy, but for security and economic reasons, it's private. Somebody's asking about
you've got
whether
to have
this will be
some
on
discretion
YouTube.
there,
Yeah,
with something
yeah.
like the clergy project.
Yeah. Diane, who is head of our legal department here with Secular AZ, she says the US has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have not ratified it. We were one of the main drafters, but then changed members of the Senate and not have been able to ratify since.
Right.
So
Sorry, I
there's
should have
some
said ratified. Yeah.
Well, Diane, thank
appreciate
goodness
it.
she always keeps us on our P's and Q's. Mary, who's one of our board members, is suggesting a podcast called Graceful Atheist. It's good about the whole idea of deconstruction and deconversion stories. There's some other suggestions and a link, of course, to Chrissy's book. And then there is one more question that I'm seeing, and I want to honor your time, Chrissy, because this has been really, so I just appreciate you coming. So here's one that I'm getting out of the chat. It looks like there. Okay, if there's a couple more than you'd be willing to take,
I can take a couple more questions.
We'll gladly let you take them.
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay, so Jeffrey is asking, what do you know about Christian nationalists placing supporters in key election posts across the country, spurring fears about future vote challenges? Good question.
This is a good question. And I mean, I don't know very much that's specific, because a lot of this, I'm sure, is something that they're trying to keep hush-hush, but voter suppression efforts, it's another one of that whole slate of issues that is associated with Christian nationalism that they do tend to support. And Christian nationalist candidates like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, he's very big on the whole false narrative of the stolen 2020 election. A lot of them are, and he actually did say that if he's elected governor of Pennsylvania, which is a real possibility, although some Pennsylvania Republicans are upset that he won the primary because they think he's actually too extreme to be elected by Pennsylvania voters, and I sure do hope they're right. But he has said that he would put a Secretary of State in who would do like a reset and would immediately purge everyone from the voter rolls and make everyone re-register to vote. So that's definitely shady. That's the one very specific example I can think of off the top of my head. But the best thing to do for most of us, and particularly for people who live in ground zero, for places where Christian nationalists have a lot of power, though they're trying to take it everywhere right now. I mean, even here in Portland, you do see some indications of that, but it's just try to keep abreast of what's happening locally and do what you can to step up for those battles, because it's impossible to keep track of or try to help with everything that's happening across the United States. I think that I would like to see somebody do a study on this, though, if there is information out there about specific efforts to change voting procedures or election procedures, or install people at the state level who would, not do what a lot of those even Republican secretaries of state did in the 2020 election, which was certify the results, even though a lot of their base was screaming at them not to. I suspect we'll be seeing some efforts for that. And it'd be good if there was something like, you're probably familiar with like blitzwatch.org, right? Which is monitoring the Project Blitz legislation that gets passed and that sort of. If there was something like that for these efforts, ones that can be publicly discovered or that might have been reported on in local news, that would be great. But yeah, I don't know any more specifics about that.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think that this last question is the perfect question, especially given your background. So what do you know about Christian nationalists placing supporters? Oh, wait, sorry. Wrong one. What strategies can one employ that illustrate to other believers how Christian nationalism could harm them and everyone else? This is a great question here in Arizona too, because we've actually seen some folks who would traditionally think that would be on our side, Democrats, voting yes on some of these far-reaching, the HB 2507, which is a far-reaching opening up of any kind of religious exemption, 2707, which opens prayer in schools. Some of these were either supported by Democrats, co-sponsored by Democrats. And while we are a nonpartisan organization, we do support the issues. And it's alarming because so many of those Christian nationalists bills are obviously coming from one particular party. So when we see it happen, or when maybe we have to deal with it at the Thanksgiving dinner or whatever, are there things that you say or strategies that you use to help people understand, though they're believers themselves, that this is dangerous rhetoric and that we should all be like hands on deck right now,
That is a very important question. And we all have to think about how we, as atheists, humanists, agnostics, secular people, whatever, how we interact with religious people in our society. And I don't really tend to appreciate very sort of utopian notions of anti-theism, as if you can just pretend that, Christianity will go away because it's nonsense, or not just Christianity, but all religion. This is not happening for probably thousands and thousands of years, if ever, if humans even live that long, which honestly, I'm not giving us the greatest odds at this moment. So we do have to think about how we coexist with religious people. So I position myself as pro-pluralism, and I try to be very principled about that. So for example, if I don't want believers coming along and getting in my face and trying to convert me to Christianity, I am going to do my best to respect, at least as long as they're practicing a sort of non-harmful kind of Christianity, or if we're just out and about, whatever their Christianity is, I'm not going to get in their face and try to say, and here's why you should accept science and reason and just give up all that silly religious nonsense. I mean, I don't think street epistemology is helpful. This comes from the background of someone who actually used to go out and hand out tracts on the street in downtown Indianapolis. And now I have almost a kind of like, sort of knee-jerk fear reaction every time I see someone with a clipboard or a pamphlet that they're like, do you want to donate to the ACLU Oregon? No, go away, you have a clipboard. Because I don't like that. But anyway, sorry, I got a little bit distracted there. I position myself as pro-pluralist and as against anti-theism, because I think it is counterproductive. But that's kind of really big picture. And it works well for when you're working with like, a national organization that clearly shares certain values with you. So like I've worked with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, for example. When it comes to just talking to people about how Christian nationalism could be bad for them, I do think that's a good general point. And if you want to look for a lot of specifics about how to make that case, I would highly recommend that people get familiar with the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. Interestingly, I talked a little bit in my talk about how the Southern Baptist Convention became this extreme right-wing machine, and that was complete by the 1990s. In the 1990s, they broke off all ties and all funding with this Baptist Joint Committee. The Baptist Joint Committee represents, your sort of more old-fashioned Jimmy Carter type Baptists who have this very principled stance where indeed they are very much for the separation of church and state, unlike the Southern Baptists. And they will argue from a theological point of view that merging of church and state is corrupting to both the church and the state. So they are with us on a lot of issues. And they also produced this report earlier this year in collaboration with the Freedom from Religion Foundation about Christian nationalism. There's a lot of really good stuff in the report written by different authors from their own perspectives, some of them Christians, some of them atheists. A lot of it written by Andrew Seidel, of course, a prominent atheist advocate and legal scholar. But yeah, there's some good stuff in there that might help with these talking points. And in general, check out the Baptist Joint Committee because they have the theological arguments that you might be able to make around the dinner table at Thanksgiving or whatever.
Well, and I agree too. I think just about any book that Andrew Seidel puts out is pretty good about helping those of us who maybe need some help to talk to that angry uncle and Thanksgiving or whatever.
Mine never lets you get a word in edgewise.
You know, the funny thing about the people in my family where we no longer agree on things, they'll always tell me, please just let's not talk about anything political. And then 2 seconds into seeing them from a year of not seeing them, oh, well, what do you think about these gas prices and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, so we've just stopped celebrating together, which is unfortunate, but thankfully I have my own Arizona family. I'm grateful for that. And part of that family comes from our membership here with Secular AZ. So I want to say thank you to you, Chrissy Stroop. Honestly, like I said, when I saw you on screen and it wasn't just like a tweet or something like that, I got so happy. So thank you.
So sweet.
Thank you for supporting us here. I see that Lindsay has put in the chat that we have some upcoming events. In the very beginning, Chrissy brought up the fact that our school board races are kind of ground zero for watching Christian nationalism play out in real time in the heart of our democracy, which is our school boards. So we will continue to have our school board candidate forums. We have one coming up on June 8th. Of course, you can see, because she shared her screen, that we have some other events happening with the Humanist Society, Arizona End of Life Options, who are a really wonderful organization here in Arizona. There is the virtual lobbying day being put on by, I think it's the American Atheists and the American Humanist Association. So there's a link there to sign up for that. And then on June 28th, we have Heather Weaver, who is senior staff attorney with ACLU, and she's going to be talking about the SCOTUS case, Kennedy versus Bremerton. So I hope that all of you will join us for those different events. And again, thank you so much, Chrissy. Are there any closing words that you maybe have for the folks out there?
Thank you so much for having me, Jeannie, Lindsay. It's been my pleasure to be here. And I don't really have any wise parting words off the top of my head, but you know, if you ever want to reach me about something, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so you can find me there. I do, maybe one thing I can say is I do have a website. I don't really update the blog on it anymore, but it's at cstroop.com. And if you are interested in just little sort of like distillations of talking points and things about about pluralism and citizenship and the way I think about those things, I've put together some infographics. You can find them there. You can download, distribute them for free. They're just a resource I've made for people. So that's at cstroop.com/infographics. And I have one on pluralism that's very popular.
Right on. Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us for another speaker series. Thank you again to Chrissy Stroop. And thanks to everybody for showing up. And don't forget, secularaz.org. We are a 501c3 organization that relies on the kindness of strangers or people who are just simply passionate about the separation of church and state. So go ahead, take a look at us and make sure that you join, donate, etc., so you can see more conversations like this. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.